So this morning I'm going to talk a little bit about soybean recommendations for Kentucky. And I have new on here. This data is not new. This data was generated by my predecessor, Jim Herbeck, from 2006 to 2011. Okay, I came in about 2013. So the data is not new, but I'm not sure that we've publicized our new findings like we should. And Chad and I have received, over the past 2 years, an enormous amount of questions about how late we can plant soybeans, okay? Last year and this year, it was a function of flooding, right? We've had a lot of flooding the past 2 years in parts of the state. This year, a much wider region of the state. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about that today. So this research was funded by the Kentucky Soybean Promotion Board. Like I said, my predecessor conducted the experiment. It was a 6-year study, okay? Even for research, that's a lot of years. And that's good because he captured the wide range of possible environments that could happen in Kentucky, okay? He also examined 2 relative maturity groups, okay? A late 2 and like a mid 4, all right? And those varieties did kind of hop around between the years just because of availability. And we know that, right? Things go on the market, things go off the market. But he tried to target that mid 4 and a late 2, okay? He had 7 planting dates for the group 4. And he pared that down to 3 planting dates for the group 2 just for space. I mean, this study was getting enormous, okay? And so just for space and resources. So the planting dates are here for each of the 6 years. You can read them yourself. Basically, they range from mid-April all the way up to early July, okay? What he was seeing was when he was looking at the soybean yield contest entries each year, he was noticing that the winners or a lot of the entries had really early, what he considered early planting dates, okay? Prior to this study, the recommendation was that from UK that if you got your beans in by June or so, you should be okay, all right? And you should have maximum yield. But what he was seeing was these early, mid-April plantings that were doing quite well in certain parts of the state. And so the weather conditions, that's a big part of yield for any crop, right? What did the weather do that year? And so I've just thrown up a lot of information in these next 2 slides. But basically, look, we've got the trend line here, which is the 30-year average, okay? Here we're looking at precipitation, so rainfall. And you can see there's a range of years that have more normal amounts of rainfall, really high amounts of rainfall, and then low rainfall, right? So at least for precipitation, we captured all possible scenarios. Same thing for maximum high temperature, okay? In those 6 years, we went from really cool throughout the whole growing season. And those cool years were associated with the high rainfall. So we're going to expect really high yields, right? And that's what he got. We also have really hot years, and those were associated with dry years as well. So we had hot, dry, cool, wet, and then we had more of a normal, if I can say normal, we had more of a normal weather pattern, okay? So in terms of the late group 2, what did he find? And if you look here, look within a row. And if the yield is followed by a different letter, that means it's significantly different according to statistics, okay? All right, so what we found, at least he found in 2006, was that planting date 4, which was late May, had the highest yield. All right? But for the rest of the years, it was this first planting date that had the highest yield. All right? For the mid-group 4, what are we seeing? Lots of information, right? And lots of numbers. But really, if you start looking at it, it's these first 2 planting dates. Really, that's the trend. The earlier you can plant, the higher your yield's going to be. Okay? I think that surprised him a little bit. Actually, I know it did because we talked about this when I first started. He said he was very surprised that these mid to late April plantings did so well because based upon, 15, 20 years of data prior to that, in his experience, this was too early to plant, okay? So just with the new technology, the seed treatments, the varieties that we now have available to us, he thought maybe was what was pushing back our ability to plant quite a bit earlier than previous recommendations. All right? So like I said, the past 2 years have been wet. There's been several places. Where's Adam Barnes? Where are you? Is he not in here? There he is. Adam Barnes last year sent me a photograph of him canoeing a soybean field. Literally canoeing. And I could not find that picture. That's the one I wanted, okay? He was canoeing through a soybean field. What was it, Adam? 2 foot, 3 foot of water? It's quite a bit of water. Quite a bit of water, okay? And so Chad and I have had a lot of questions this year and last year. How late can I plant my soybeans? What is my expected yield? And so this data set from Jim actually allowed us to do some new regression curves, okay? And we're able to predict possible yield loss per day after a specific planting date, all right? And this is very helpful. There is one caveat that I'll get to in a moment. But basically for these late group 2s, if you haven't planted by mid-April, you're immediately losing yield potential for the late 2s, okay? So this is the percentage of the maximum per year because we did have those annual fluctuations, right? So we went on a percentage of maximum yield for that year. And the 100% potential yield came early by April 20th, all right? After April 20th, what are we losing? About 0.42% of your yield per day, okay? And those are a little bit different numbers than we had previously reported as the university. What about for the group 4s, mid-group 4s? That's probably what most people plant, right? That's more normal for Kentucky. Well, what we found was sort of this segmented line, okay? So what we found was that from mid-April to about the beginning of May, we did have a slight decline. Do you see that? But it was not statistically significant, okay? So we can't say that you are for sure losing yield. But the slope of this was 0.12%, okay? Just so you know. So basically what we're saying is around May 9th, early May, is when you start seeing this marked and statistically significant yield decline, all right? What does that mean? That means if you plant past May 9th, you're going to be losing 0.5% of yield per day, okay? Doesn't sound like a whole lot, but it adds up pretty quick. And I don't know, did I mention that this research was done here at Princeton? Just if I didn't. So I think most of the calls that I've gotten is, okay, if I plant today, what kind of yield am I going to get? Well, it's kind of hard for us to tell you, right? So, but sort of this data will help us give you that information. So if we planted today or in the next...
Were they all done the same population?
They were all done the same population. That's a great question. And actually, I think he seeded at 225. John, is that right? 225,000. Why? Why did he seed so high? He wanted to make sure that there were not any plant population differences to be affecting the yield. So he overseeded, okay? The end plant populations, even for those really early dates, were still at least 150, wasn't it, John? So they were pretty good plant populations. The early May, mid-May, were more like 150 final plant populations. And then once you got later to those later planting dates, it was about 180, 190. Yes?
Row spacing?
Row spacing 15 inches. Yeah. What other questions? I'll try to answer. I might bop them back to John, my technician. He was here doing the work with Jim.
Was it a very variety, very tolerant, or very resistant to sudden death?
You know, I don't know if it was resistant to sudden death. What he did is he requested it from Pioneer.
About
yeah.
Early plant in April. You know, that's one of my biggest concerns.
Yeah.
It was done on the front side of the farm here where sudden death is not expected.
Yeah, I don't think we have sudden death here. Yeah, but he was concerned about those cool soils. And what happened, and I did not put this data here, is that it took a whole lot longer for those beans to emerge in those early plantings. Up to 14 to 20 days some years. I mean, that makes us nervous, right?
Some planted in middle of May. It took that long this year.
Yeah, I did too. That's right. But it makes us very nervous, right? And so that's another consideration to think about with these early plantings. The other one is, if you are planting early and you have this long period before emergence, you're likely going to miss a late spring freeze, right? Because that's another concern. Are we going to get a late freeze to zap those back? Yes?
Them coming up late, what about your emergence and your final stand and the vigor once they got going? I mean, did you get a lower percentage coming up and were they slower coming off?
The early or late? I'm sorry. The early beans were slower to come on. I wasn't here to see about the vigor, but like I said, the final plant populations were still 150, and the 150 range, even with those early April and mid-April plantings.
Dropped 220 to get to 150.
That's right. He dropped 225 to get about 150. Yeah. So you're right about that. You got to have good vigor seed lot, which you can't always predict. John, do you know were they treated beans?
Yes.
They were treated beans too, so that would help as well. What other questions? So when Chad and I got all these calls, Chad was using some data that was prior to this. I was using this when I was making my recommendations and telling agents and producers what to expect. And so really what you have to do is look at the optimum planting date, right? So what is the optimum planting date that we identified with this new data? Well, it was April 20th for the group 2s, right? So what you have to do is count up the number of days from April 20. So if we planted today a group 2, it's about 100 days later. So we're going to expect a 42% yield loss, okay? Assuming your typical average would have been 65 bushels per acre, I mean, we're talking less than 30 bushels, right? And so when Chad and I get those calls, that's kind of the process we go through. We say, okay, what are the environmental conditions? What do you normally expect out of this field? And given the data we have, this is the yield loss you should expect. For the group 4s, we're about 80 days out from the optimal planting date, okay? 40% yield loss, so around that 30 bushel. Now, the one caveat I haven't even touched on yet is how late can we plant? Now, statistically, we can keep going out and extrapolating what your percentage yield loss is to a date, right? But what am I not considering here? What's that? Weather, that's true. So that's assuming, this yield loss is assuming everything else is perfect the rest of the year. You get the water when you need it, you're not excessively hot, anything else. Frost. We're also assuming a later frost date, right? Last year there were a lot of people, let's see, Rankin, I see Rankin Powell from Union County. I think he had some producers plant in August, first week of August, towards the end of that week. We're talking like August 7th-ish. And they made 30 bushels, I think he said. But we had a late frost, right, for the season. They had a late frost. They did not have a timely frost according to weather data, and they didn't have an early frost. So it's always a gamble. But I can understand why we want to put beans in. You're going to have to do weed control anyway on these fields, right? Why not try to get a crop off of it as well? But the last 2 years, we have been pretty lucky in that we've had later frost than we would normally expect. That would help us get in, be able to harvest those beans and get decent yields. So, what other questions do y'all have? I think my time's up. None? Well, thank y'all. Yes.
Have you come to the point to recommend they have 2 planters when they start planting corn, they start planting beans?
Did everybody hear that? Is our recommendation now to have 2 planters, one for corn, one for beans? I mean, if you want those high yields, the earlier you can plant beans, the higher yields you can get, right? And it's a consideration in logistics. Yes, in the back. Does it matter what? I'm sorry. That's true. He said, why does it matter? Because if you plant on April 29th and they lay there for 3 weeks, what's it matter? It's a function of the statistics, right? I mean, but I see your point. Some years they rocket out of the ground, though, right? In those years, you're going to get the yield benefit. The other years, maybe not. So that's all kind of combined in that statistical analysis. Yes?
So the other years you get to replant.
Other years you get to replant. Now, come on. Yes. So the question was, did we look at planting date studies on mid-3s? And no. He did it basically for the late 2s and the mid-4s, and that was his study. Yeah. Anything else? What about harvest date? Well, he didn't have that constraint in the data, right? So the question is, do you have to worry about shattering? Because if you're trying to shell corn and cut beans, what happens? And so this is assuming that you get in and harvest in a timely manner. And no frost damage, and everything went perfectly throughout the year. Thank y'all so much. I love questions. So y'all made my day.